everyone, and welcome to Bassman Studio. Now, in this episode of Bassman Studio, I'm going to teach you about perspective. That means how to show things going into the distance, how to create the illusion of space, and create the illusion that you could walk into your art. So it's very important, and it's a great way to create an imaginary effect, such as if you want people to feel like they could walk into your art, walk into your painting. So it's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm glad you're joining me today at Bassman Studio. So sit back and relax and enjoy. So here we have our perspective, as you can see. So everything is converging into what we call a vanishing point. It's this point right here, and this is what we call the horizon line. So everything is going to start from large here, and as it gets closer to the vanishing point, it's going to get smaller. This is what we call one-point perspective. So anything that goes toward this vanishing point gets smaller. So that's going to be our guide for our painting. So I'm going to create something out of my imagination. So let's say, and you could try this too. Just for practice, I'm going to take some black. I'm going to draw with the brush. So I'm going to draw, let's say, a tree over here. And this tree is going to be larger because it's in the foreground. Remember, this is our foreground. The foreground means anything that's in our immediate vicinity, meaning close to us, right? So anything here is going to be large. Now, if I draw a tree, let's say, closer to the horizon line and the vanishing point, it'll be very small because things in the distance get smaller as they go further back. And this is what we call perspective. Now, there's different kinds of perspective. This is the simplest kind, which is one-point perspective. There's two-point perspective as well. But we're going to focus on one-point perspective for today. So let's say that if I were to paint any imagination, any landscape out of my imagination, I could paint, let's say, some rolling hills. And this is just for practice, right? Rolling hills here. And maybe there's some sort of castle or house in the distance. Let's make it a castle just for the fun of it. And of course, that's going to be very small in the distance. So if there's a road leading toward the horizon line, it's going to start off very small, almost like vanishing into nothing. And as it gets closer to us, it's going to get larger and larger. So you see that goes in the distance. And we could put a few more trees around just for the fun of it and just to give a sense of distance. So let's say there's a tree, second tree here in the foreground. It's going to be large. And a few more other trees, like let's say scattered around. So here and here. And you can see how loose I'm doing this. So my object is to make this look like it could go further back into the distance. So if there's a tree, let's say, really, really far away, it's almost minuscule and you can't really see it. It'll be almost not seen. And that's going to give the illusion of space. So when you see paintings or drawings that look like you could walk right into them, this is how they're done by perspective. So now let's talk about color. Now, if I start with like this enormous sky, I could add some clouds up here just to give a sense of sky. Let's say that there's a few clouds. Now that has nothing to do with perspective, but clouds also recede in the distance. So there could be even clouds back here that are smaller. And that is perspective. So they are going further back into the distance. Sometimes you do have like an evening sky and the clouds just recede and recede. And those are quite beautiful. So now I'm going to take some paint. And as you can see, I've been painting the sky. So now as I get closer to the horizon line, it's going to get very light. And I've gone over this in my previous lessons about landscape painting. As the sky gets closer to horizon line, it gets lighter, maybe a little yellowish. So you could add a little bit of yellow, making it slightly lighter. And that's going to give our illusion of space and perspective. Could exaggerate a little bit. So remember, you want to keep it fairly wet because it's acrylic or any water-based media like watercolor. And now as I get closer to the horizon line, I could get very expressive and perhaps use just a pure yellow and some white, just to give it a little bit of power. Maybe make it like a late afternoon scene. You see it's becoming a little lighter in the bottom. As it gets closer to our horizon line. Now remember what the horizon line is. That's the line that's dividing Earth and sky. What we call our horizon line. It's important. It's what the perspective lines lead to and where your vanishing point is. And these terms are good to know because they explain what everything is. More important that you know what they do rather than how to pronounce them, and to remember the phrases. Just remember what they do in art, how they help you. So you can see there we have our sky going from dark to light. Now in terms of trees, now let's say I start with this tree in the foreground. So this tree is going to be much darker than, let's say, this tree in the distance, or these trees. So with this tree, I'm going to start with a very dark greenish yellow. And remember, in terms of perspective, anything that goes further back in perspective gets lighter, more blue. So this is going to be, let's say, a very bright greenish color. And that's the foreground color of that foreground tree. Now, if I were to choose, let's say, a tree in the distance, I could make it lighter by adding white and perhaps a little blue. So it's going to turn a bluish green. So it's a little more in the distance. It's going to give the illusion that it's further back in the distance. And trees very, very far away almost become blue themselves, very distant. So you see that this is the illusion of perspective in terms of color. So this gives our illusion of space, from dark to light. And this is what happens in nature. So we have our very bright greenish tree, bright yellow, and yellow as a primary is the color, the warm color that brings things forward. Any warm color is going to bring things forward, and a cool color such as blue is going to push things back in distance. So for our castle, if it was very, very far away, it would look almost bluish. It may be made of stone, but so far away it's almost imperceptible. It becomes a blue, almost a bluish haze, sometimes purple, but a bluish haze. So painting a few of our trees, let's say these middle trees here, just going to put them in there because I drew them in. Now let's say we have these beautiful rolling hills. So starting with the immediate foreground, we're going to paint that a beautiful yellowish green just to push it forward. And we're going to use this color for our immediate foreground, meaning anything close to us. And as the color gets further into the distance, let's say these hills over here are going to turn blue again, or even purple. Anything in the cool range, as they're going to be further into the distance. That's we call aerial perspective. Now again, all these fancy terms that I'm mentioning today are important to know. You don't have to remember the terms themselves, but remember what perspective does in nature, because that helps you in your painting and your drawing. It's more important to know what they do. So you see, that's extremely warm. So let's say I'm going to choose that hill in the distance, just to give you an idea of what happens in perspective. So I'm going to make it a very bluish, light green color. Very different, as you can see. And that, optically, that pushes it back. If you go out in nature and you see what happens to hills as they get further away, they turn this color. They turn in a bluish, even a cityscape, if you look at buildings, they turn bluish or bluish purple as they get further back in the distance. So you can see the difference. And as enjoyable as this is to paint, I could just keep going and paint in a little bit more of the hills. And you can see it's really getting further back in the distance. This is again aerial perspective. That things further back in the distance get hazier and more blue as they get pushed back. And if you look at any, even the Impressionist painters, let's say Monet, you could see he does that, and of course he knows all that. It's a beautiful effect. And sometimes they would exaggerate a little bit, because of course you can do that as well and use their artistic license. So you can see it's really pushing back into the distance. Now, this is the hill that's closer to us, and we call the middle ground. So it's not the background and it's not the foreground, but it's getting slightly closer. So I added a little bit more yellow to bring it forward a little bit, just slightly. Perhaps not as yellow as this. As you can see, it's the middle ground. So it's just a very slow gradation toward a very bright color, just to give the illusion that it's coming closer and closer. So I added some yellow with a little bit of blue and some green. And again, I'm just blocking in, just putting in the big shapes. So again, with this immediate foreground, as much as I finish the middle ground, with the immediate foreground, I'm going to add almost an exaggerated amount of yellow, just to push it very, very forward. And just enjoy doing this. Like, this should be expressive and free. And remember that it's enjoyable to experiment and try new things. So just when you can, just try this and try to experiment and see what it does. Just see how it affects your work. And remember, you know, even if you don't do it right the first time, everything comes out of practice. So keep trying it, keep doing it, and you will get the hang of it eventually, just like anything else. No one is born knowing, so you have to practice something to get good at it. As you can see, our painting already has a sense of distance. It's important. And granted, we haven't used any shadows yet. Once we start adding shadows is when it starts really having a life of its own. So now, as you can see, in terms of aerial perspective, it goes from warm, a little less warm, to cool. This is aerial perspective, and everything in the distance is getting smaller, just to go back to what I said in the beginning. So now we're going to paint the road. Now let's say it's a dirt road. Not paved or anything, just, so we're going to choose a brownish red. And again, the same rule applies, whereas anything close to us is going to be much darker and much richer in yellow. So this is the beginning of our road in the foreground. Let's say a very rich, dark, yellowish brown. And all I did was mix some black, yellow, and red to make brown. I do not have brown on my palette, so I made it. And you could do that too, or you could have brown on your palette and just add a little bit of yellow. Now, this is the middle ground, remember? And in the middle ground, it's going to get slightly lighter, so I added a little bit of white. And white, people think that white is a lightener of colors, and in some ways it does, but it also has some blue in it, and it also tones down colors at the same time. So you can see it's getting slightly lighter as it gets further back. And now this is the really, really far away part of the road. So if you remember what I said, anything very, very far away turns blue. So we're going to add a little bit of blue to our brown, and now it's going to be almost imperceptible, the road, as it gets further into the distance. So it looks like it's very, very far away. So to get to this distance from this distance from this distance, it would be very, very far, and it would take you a long time to walk. And that's the illusion that we want to show. Now, in terms of the trees, we have the foreground trees, and you can see I have not painted the trunks of the trees, the branches, anything like that. So now I'm going to start with this beautiful brownish color and just paint the first tree with branches. And it's very loose, I'm just being very loose about it. But you can see it's a very rich, dark brown. I can do the same thing with this tree. And paint a very rich, dark brown, a very loaded brush, meaning I have a lot of paint on the brush. And just paint in the roots and base of the tree. And now remember what happens with trees as they get further away. Just with anything else I just said, it's lighter. So these are going to be a little less strong. A little less strong here. And finally, in the very, very distance, almost imperceptible. Almost imperceptible as they go further back into the distance. Now here comes one of the most enjoyable parts, for me at least, is the shadows. This is where, to me at least, the real magic happens. So I'm going to choose a light source, and what I'm going to do is paint the shadows on the trees in the foreground. So the opposite of green in a complementary way is red. So I added a little bit of red for my shadows, and let's say the sun's coming this way. So shadows are going to be opposite. And as you remember from my previous videos, you just keep it simple still, and you just indicate roundness this way. And I could even put the shadow of the tree on the ground, just indicating very simply. And you can see that's giving our tree a sense of weight. And I can do the same with this tree. Very simply. And in nature too, you have a light source, a direct light source. You may have a lot of reflecting light, but there's always a major light source. The sun has to come from one direction. Now again, if I test you and I ask you what happens to things in the background, as they get further away, they get lighter. So just keep repeating that to yourself when you're painting outside or painting a landscape, that these, as further things go away from the foreground, the lighter they get. And there we have our middle ground. Trees, perhaps one here as well. And even a bit more shadows, let's say, on the hill. Now the shadow is really, really far away. Almost to a degree miles away, let's say, are going to be, again, that very light bluish green color. And you could even do a little, now we won't see detail that far, so and we could even make the horizon line a little stronger. That way there's a difference between horizon line and sky. We'll give that a big difference. As far as our building is concerned, now it's very far away, so you're not going to see any detail. So what we could do with that is we could make it a purplish color. So the shadows could be purple in nature. So it's very, very far away. Now for the clouds on my palette, I'm going to mix some sort of orange color. And this is going to be a little bit powerful. It's okay to be powerful and have things pop out a little bit more. So, like as I said, you could exaggerate. You can see it's a very rich yellowish color I'm making. So we're just going to paint in some beautiful clouds over here in this beautiful orange color. And remember, acrylic dries quick, so you have to be a little fast. And that's our first cloud. So remember, as I mentioned in previous videos, you just want to block in. Meaning that you just want to paint in the basic shape of it. So cover as much area as you can, as quickly as you can, is the key. So here's a few more clouds. And finally, our stream of clouds here, close to the horizon line. And here's where you can have a little bit of fun with it. Exaggerate a little bit. And just be expressive. So remember, the rule is that things in one point perspective, or any perspective for that matter, get smaller as they get further away from the foreground. Now it sounds like kind of almost obvious, but in art it's created a revolution in some periods in art, especially in the Renaissance. So as simple as it sounds, it made a profound impact in the history of art. So finally I could even exaggerate a little bit and make this horizon line more yellow and more prominent, giving it a glow, so to speak. Remember, the object is that you make your work interesting and powerful. So we don't want to show fear. We want to show bravery. So exaggerate a little bit if you can. You're the artist. You could manipulate things and change things if you want. And finally, we can go back to our road and clean it up a little bit. You know, add things on the side, give it a bit more strength and power. Clean up anything we haven't painted. So remember the rules of aerial perspective, so that things closer get warmer and more yellowish in color. Things in the distance are going to get more blue. purplish or blue in color. Anything in the distance gets cool in color. Cools are the blues. And it's easy to remember. If you think hot, you think red, you think yellow, right? And if you think cold, you think ice. So you think white, blue, etc. And finally, we have our distance. So, and we just clean this up a little bit. And here we have our finished, landscape and lesson in 1-point perspective. Well, I hope you enjoyed that lesson from Bassman Studio. I hope it put things in perspective for you and that you learned a lot. So remember to do your best to practice perspective. Practice it when you're anything, if you're painting a model or drawing up for a model, but especially if you're doing landscapes. It's extremely important. So remember, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. Any questions or comments are very welcome. So you could just let me know if you have any questions or comments, or perhaps a lesson you'd like me to do in the near future. Just let me know and I'll consider it. So thanks again for watching. Have an amazing and creative day, and I'll see you next time at Bassman Studio.